Sometimes the wealthiest man can be the loneliest soul. Have you ever wondered if people truly see you or just what you can give them? Einar Goldtooth had everything a Viking could want. Vast lands, endless silver and fame that echoed through every fjord. But every woman who approached him wanted his treasure, not his heart. So this mighty warrior did something no one expected. He left his riches behind and became a simple fisherman in a distant village. There, hauling nets and mending boats, he hoped to find what gold never could, someone who would love him for who he truly was. Then he met Astrid, a brewmaster's daughter who had no patience for bragging men and wealthy fools. She saw him as just another fisherman, and for the first time Einar felt truly seen. But how long can love built on lies really last? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the northern fjords like the breath of sleeping giants, and through it, Einar Goldtooth's estate stretched toward the horizon with an authority that spoke of conquest and careful stewardship. His great hall stood 3 stories high, its carved dragon heads catching the first light of dawn, while smoke from a dozen hearths painted lazy spirals against the pearl-grey sky. From his bedchamber window, Einar could count 30 horses grazing in the lower meadows, each one worth a poor man's yearly earnings. At 42 winters, Einar possessed what most men could only dream of achieving. His war chest contained enough silver to purchase 3 villages. His armory held weapons that sang legends, and his reputation as a warrior extended from the ice-bound northern reaches to the trading ports of the southern coasts. The golden tooth that gave him his name, a replacement for one lost in his first great battle, had become a symbol of his prosperity. When he smiled, which was rare these days, it caught light like a beacon announcing his wealth to all who looked upon him. But this morning, as he had every morning for the past year, Einar felt the familiar weight of solitude pressing against his chest like poorly fitted mail. The vast hall below echoed with the footsteps of servants, the clatter of breakfast preparations, and the quiet efficiency of a household that ran itself. Yet for all its activity the space felt hollow, as if the very walls absorbed warmth and left only cold stone behind. "My lord," came a voice from the doorway. Bjorn Ironwill, his most trusted retainer, entered carrying a steaming bowl of porridge and honey. The man had served Einar's family for 25 years, first his father, then him. Grey now touched Bjorn's temples, and lines mapped the campaigns they'd shared across his weathered face. "The morning meal awaits, and you have 3 visitors in the great hall." Einar turned from the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the morning light. Standing just over 6 feet, he carried himself with the unconscious grace of a man accustomed to command. His blonde hair, streaked now with premature silver, was bound back in the warrior's knot, and his ice-blue eyes held depths that spoke of both triumph and weariness. "More suitors?" he asked. Though he already knew the answer, Bjorn's expression remained carefully neutral. "Shield maidens from the eastern settlements. They bring gifts and speak of alliances through marriage." Einar's jaw tightened. In the past month alone, 7 women had made the journey to his estate, each beautiful, each accomplished in the arts of war or household management, each seeing him not as a man, but as a collection of assets to be acquired. They spoke sweetly of love, while their eyes calculated the worth of his silver arm rings. They praised his wisdom, while mentally cataloguing his livestock. They offered their bodies, while measuring the size of his treasure room. "Tell them I'm ill," Einar said, moving toward his armor stand where his most prized possession hung, Bloodsong, the war axe that had carved his legend. The weapon's steel head gleamed with careful maintenance, its edge sharp enough to split a hair. Ancient runes ran along its handle, promising victory to the worthy and death to the false-hearted. It had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that, a symbol of their family's honor and martial prowess. "My lord," Bjorn said carefully, "perhaps you should at least speak with them." The youngest, Sigrid Ravenhair, brings word from Jarl Olsen. He seeks to strengthen trade agreements through marriage alliance. Einar's hand paused on Bloodsong's handle. Politics and alliances, the eternal dance of the powerful. His wealth hadn't been built on conquest alone, but on the careful cultivation of relationships, the strategic marriages and trade agreements that turned spoils of war into lasting prosperity. Yet the thought of another calculated conversation about bloodlines and dowries made his stomach turn. "I've grown tired of being courted like a prize bull," he said finally. "Every woman who enters these halls sees gold before she sees me. When they speak my name, they taste silver. When they touch my hand, they count my rings." Bjorn set the porridge on a small table and studied his master with the familiarity of long service. "You speak as if all women are merchants in love's market, aren't they?" Einar's voice carried a bitterness that surprised even him. "Show me one who would choose a poor fisherman over a wealthy jarl. Show me one who would love a man for his heart rather than his hoard." The challenge hung in the air between them, unanswerable because it spoke to a truth both men understood. In their world, love was a luxury few could afford. Marriage served to unite families, secure alliances, and ensure prosperity. Romance belonged in skald songs, not in the practical calculations of real life. Einar moved to his treasure chest, a massive oak container bound with iron and secured with 3 separate locks. Inside lay the accumulated wealth of 3 generations. Silver armlets thick as a man's wrist, golden brooches set with amber from the eastern seas, jeweled daggers that caught light like captured stars. Each piece told a story of conquest, each represented a victory or successful trade. Yet looking at them now, he felt only the chill of metal against his skin. "Do you remember?" he said, lifting a silver arm ring and watching it catch the morning light. "When we were young warriors following my father into battle, we had nothing then but our weapons and our courage. Yet I felt richer than I do now." Bjorn nodded slowly. "A man values most what he lacks. You had no gold then, so you didn't know its weight. Now you have no love, so you feel its absence." "Wise words," Einar said, though they brought little comfort. He replaced the arm ring and closed the chest with deliberate care. "Send the ladies away with gifts and kind words. Tell them I'm honored by their interest, but not ready for marriage. And if they ask when you might be ready." Einar was quiet for a long moment, his mind turning over a thought that had been growing like a seed in winter soil. "Tell them I'll marry when I find a woman who can love a poor man as deeply as a rich one." Bjorn's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's an interesting condition, my lord. How would you test such a thing?" The question sparked something in Einar's mind, a possibility so audacious it made his pulse quicken. For months he'd felt trapped by his own success, imprisoned by the very wealth that was supposed to bring him freedom. But what if that prison had a door he'd never noticed? What if the answer wasn't to find a different woman, but to become a different man? "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the test isn't finding such a woman, but becoming such a man." That evening, after the disappointed suitors had departed with their gifts and diplomatic explanations, Einar sat alone in his great hall before a fire that could have roasted an entire pig. The flames danced across the carved pillars that supported the vaulted ceiling, each one depicting scenes from his family's history. Warriors charging into battle, ships cutting through stormy seas, feasts celebrating victories. All the moments that had built this legacy he now found so burdensome. The hall could seat 50 people for feast. But tonight it held only one man and his growing certainty. He thought of the villages to the south, small fishing communities where men worked with their hands and measured wealth in nets full of fish rather than chests full of silver. Places where a man's reputation came from his character rather than his conquests, where women might judge suitors by the steadiness of their hands rather than the weight of their purses. He could do it. The realization came to him with crystalline clarity. He could shed this identity like an old cloak, travel south where his name carried no weight, and discover what manner of woman might love a simple fisherman. Not forever, he wasn't ready to abandon his responsibilities or his people, but long enough to learn whether genuine affection might exist. somewhere beyond the reach of his reputation. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars returning to the sky. In their brief light, Einar saw his future with sudden clarity. He would leave behind Einar Goldtooth, the wealthy Jarl, and become someone new, someone real in a way he hadn't been since childhood. A man who earned his bread through honest labor and won hearts through honest speech. The plan began forming in his mind with the same strategic clarity he brought to battle planning. He would need simple clothes, a false name, and a destination far enough south that his reputation hadn't traveled. Most importantly, he would need to leave behind everything that marked him as wealthy. His golden tooth might give him away, but perhaps in lamplight and distance it would pass for simple metal. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Einar felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Tomorrow he would begin planning the greatest deception of his life, not for conquest or gain, but for something far more precious, the chance to be loved for who he was rather than what he owned. He thought of Bloodsong hanging in his chamber, of the treasure chest with its impossible weight of wealth, of the great hall that echoed with the loneliness of success. All of it would wait for his return. But first, he would discover whether the heart of Einar Goldtooth was worth more than his gold. The last log crumbled into glowing embers, and in their dying light, a wealthy Jarl made plans to become a poor fisherman. Not for conquest this time, but for something he'd never thought to win through battle, a love that was freely given rather than strategically awarded. 3 days of preparation transformed Einar Goldtooth from the lord of the northern fjords into someone his own mother wouldn't recognize. In the privacy of his chambers, he traded silk tunics for rough-woven wool, golden arm rings for simple leather braces, and polished boots for worn fishing sandals that had seen honest work. The transformation felt like molting, shedding an old skin to reveal something raw and new beneath. The simple fishing net he'd acquired from a coastal trader lay across his bed like a symbol of his new life. Its fibers were coarse against his palms, so different from the silk banners and fine weapons he was accustomed to handling. Each knot had been tied by working hands, each strand bore the salt stains of real labor. When he lifted it, the net felt lighter than his ceremonial sword, yet somehow carried more weight, the weight of genuine purpose. "You're certain about this madness?" Bjorn asked, watching his master examine his reflection in a polished shield. Gone was the golden tooth's gleam. Einar had darkened it with ash and soot until it looked like common metal. His hair hung loose around his shoulders rather than bound in the warrior's knot, and 3 days without shaving had roughened his jaw with stubble. "More certain than I've been about anything in years," Einar replied, adjusting the simple wooden clasp that held his plain brown cloak. "I look like a fisherman, don't I?" Bjorn circled him with the critical eye of a man who'd spent decades assessing threats and opportunities. "You look like a fisherman who's never held a net. Your hands are too soft, your stance too proud, and you still move like a man accustomed to command." "Those things will change with practice," Einar said, though he could hear the confidence in his own voice, the unconscious authority of someone who'd never doubted his right to be obeyed. He made a conscious effort to slump his shoulders, to let uncertainty creep into his expression. "Better?" "Slightly. But remember, my lord, fishermen don't choose their words like jarls composing treaties. They speak simply directly. They worry about the weather and their nets, not trade routes and political alliances." Einar nodded, filing away the advice. This deception would require more than costume. It would demand a complete transformation of manner and speech. He thought of the fishing villages he'd visited in his youth, trying to recall how the men carried themselves, how they spoke, what consumed their daily thoughts. "What will you tell the household?" he asked. "That you've gone north to inspect new territories? It's believable. You've done such journeys before." "I'll handle all estate business until your return." Bjorn's expression grew serious. "How long do you intend to maintain this disguise?" "Long enough to know if what I'm seeking exists." Einar shouldered a simple leather pack containing his few possessions. No silver, no jewelry, no weapons beyond a basic fishing knife. The absence of weight felt strange, as if he might float away without the familiar burden of wealth anchoring him to the earth. The village of Svanhalla lay 2 days' journey south. A fishing community, small enough that strangers would be noticed, but large enough to provide work and lodging. Einar had chosen it carefully from his mental map of the coastal settlements, prosperous enough to support newcomers, far enough from his estate to ensure anonymity. His journey south proved harder than expected. Without his usual retinue of guards and servants, every step had to be earned through his own effort. His horse was a simple brown mare rather than his usual destrier, and she plodded along with the patient resignation of an animal bred for work rather than war. By the first evening, muscles he'd forgotten he possessed ached from the unfamiliar rhythm of ordinary travel. He made camp beside a small stream, building his own fire and cooking his own simple meal of bread and dried fish. The tasks that servants had performed invisibly for decades now demanded his full attention. The fire wouldn't catch properly at first, and when it finally blazed, it smoked terribly until he learned to tend it with the right touch. Even preparing his bedroll required thought and adjustment. But as he lay beneath stars unmarked by the carved ceiling of his great hall, Einar felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of work accomplished by his own hands. His fingers bore small burns from the fire. His back ached from sleeping on hard ground, yet he felt more present in his own body than he had in months. This was what it meant to be responsible for oneself. To survive through effort rather than inheritance. The second day brought him within sight of Svanhalla as the sun painted the fjord in shades of gold and amber. The village nestled against the water like a collection of wooden shells, its fishing boats bobbing at anchor while smoke from evening hearths drifted across the harbour. It was beautiful in its simplicity, unmarked by the grand ambitions that had shaped his own estate. Einar guided his mare down the winding path toward the village centre, noting the practical details that would shape his new life. Fish racks stood beside most houses, their wooden frames dark with salt and use. Nets hung from tall poles to dry and mend. Gardens grew vegetables rather than decorative flowers, and every structure spoke of function over form. He found lodging at the Salmon's Rest, a modest inn above the bakery run by a weathered woman named Helga, who asked no questions beyond his name and the weight of his purse. The room was small but clean, with a narrow window overlooking the harbour and a simple bed that felt luxurious after 2 nights on the ground. "You'll be wanting work, I suppose," Helga said as she showed him the wash basin and chamber pot. "Most men who come here alone are running from something or looking for something. Either way, honest work helps. I can handle a net," Einar said, surprised by how easily the lie came. "I've fished before." Helga's sharp eyes studied him with the frankness of someone who'd seen many kinds of men pass through her doors. "Have you now? Your hands say otherwise, but that's your business. Olaf Ironhand takes on crew when the fishing's good. You'll find him at the harbour before dawn." That evening, Einar walked the village streets as the sun set behind the western mountains. Svanhalla revealed itself as a place where every person knew their neighbours, where children played safely in the lanes and women chatted over garden fences. The contrast with his own estate struck him powerfully. Here was wealth of a different kind, measured in community rather than silver. He paused outside the brewery, drawn by the rich scent of fermenting grain and the sound of feminine laughter spilling through the open door. Through the window he glimpsed 3 young women working among the large wooden vats, their sleeves rolled up and their faces flushed with steam and mirth. The centre figure commanded his attention immediately, not the tallest or the most conventionally beautiful, but possessing a vitality that seemed to illuminate the entire room. She was arguing with her sisters about something, gesturing emphatically with a wooden ladle while they dissolved into giggles. Her dark hair escaped its braid in rebellious curls, and when she laughed at her own dramatic speech, the sound rang clear as bronze bells. There was an intelligence in her eyes, a sharpness that spoke of a mind that questioned everything and accepted nothing at face value. "That's Astrid Dagsdottir," said a voice behind him. Einar turned to find an elderly fisherman watching him with amusement. "Magnus, the brewmaster's middle daughter. She's got more wit than sense, and more spirit than any man can handle. Is she married?" Einar asked, then immediately regretted the directness of the question. The old man chuckled. "Half the young men in Svanhalla have tried. She sends them away like unwanted cats. Says she's waiting for a man who can match her in conversation and best her in stubbornness." He spat into the dust. "Likely to die a spinster with standards like those." As if summoned by their conversation, Astrid appeared in the brewery doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gaze swept the street and settled on Einar with curious directness. For a moment their eyes met across the lamplight, and he felt something shift in his chest. A recognition that had nothing to do with sight and everything to do with possibility. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same frank assessment Helga had employed, then turned back into the brewery without acknowledgement. But in that brief exchange, Einar had seen something that made his pulse quicken, eyes that looked at him and saw only a stranger, not a source of wealth or advancement. For the first time in years, he had been invisible. Anonymous, judged by nothing more than his presence in the moment. He walked back to the salmons, rest with a lightness in his step that had nothing to do with his reduced possessions and everything to do with the woman who had looked at him and seen simply a man. Tomorrow he would begin his new life as a fisherman, but tonight he allowed himself to hope that his impossible quest might actually succeed. The simple fishing net lay across his narrow bed like a promise, and as Einar settled into sleep, he listened to the gentle sounds of an honest village at rest. No political calculations, no strategic marriages, no wealth to protect or display, just the possibility of beginning again with nothing but himself to offer. Dawn came to Svanhalla with the cry of gulls and the creak of boat timbers, sounds that pulled Einar from the deepest sleep he'd enjoyed in months. His small room above the bakery felt like a cocoon of simplicity after the vast chambers of his estate, and for a moment he lay still, savouring the novelty of waking without the weight of a dozen decisions pressing against his mind. The harbour bustled with early morning activity when he arrived, fishermen preparing their boats with the efficient movements of long practice. Einar found Olaf Ironhand mending nets beside a weathered vessel called the Sea Wolf, his massive hands working the repair with surprising delicacy. "You'll be the new man Helga mentioned," Olaf said without looking up. His beard was white as sea foam, his shoulders broad as a ship's beam, and his eyes held the pale intensity of someone who'd spent decades reading weather and water. "Ever worked a net before?" "Some," Einar replied, grateful for the weeks he'd spent watching his estate's fishermen at work. "I can learn what I don't know." Olaf's laugh was like waves breaking on shingle. "That's what they all say. Show me your hands." Einar extended his palms, conscious of their relative softness, despite his efforts to roughen them during the journey south. Olaf's examination was thorough and unsurprising in its conclusion. "Soft as a maiden's cheek," the old fisherman pronounced. "But they're big enough and look willing to work. You'll do, if you can take instruction without argument."
"Can you?"
"I can," Einar said, suppressing his instinctive urge to mention his years of command experience. A fisherman would defer to the boat's master without question. "Good. We sail with the tide. Try not to fall overboard on your first day." The morning's work proved humbling in ways Einar hadn't anticipated. His hands, accustomed to the balanced weight of weapons, fumbled with the net's intricate workings. His back, strengthened by years of combat training, protested against the repetitive motions of hauling and casting. Most challenging of all, his mind, trained to command and strategize, had to submit to the simple rhythms of following orders and focusing on immediate tasks. But as the sun climbed higher and his muscles found their rhythm, Einar discovered unexpected satisfaction in the work. There was honesty in the ache of effort, purity in the goal of filling nets with fish. When the sea-wolf returned to harbour at midday with a respectable catch, he felt he'd earned his share in a way that commanding wealth never had. Not terrible for a first day, Olaf admitted as they secured the boat. Your hands are bleeding, but they'll toughen. Your back's sore, but it'll strengthen. Question is whether your pride can handle being worst man on a fishing crew. Einar looked at his torn palms and smiled. I think it can manage. That afternoon, he found himself at the village market, purchasing simple supplies with the few coins he'd allowed himself. The market square buzzed with the comfortable commerce of a community that knew itself well. Fishermen trading their catch for bread and vegetables, craftsmen displaying their wares, children darting between the stalls with the fearless energy of those who belonged everywhere they went. Astrid's brewing kettle caught his attention immediately, a massive copper vessel that gleamed in the afternoon sun like captured fire. She stood beside it with two of her sisters, ladling samples of ale into wooden cups for potential customers. The brewery's reputation seemed well established. A steady stream of villagers approached their stall. And from what Einar could overhear, they came as much for Astrid's conversation as for her family's ale. Magnus brews it, but Astrid perfects it, he heard one customer tell another. She's got ideas about herbs and timing that would make the old brewers weep with envy. Einar approached the stall with studied casualness, joining the line of customers as if drawn only by thirst rather than curiosity. When his turn came, Astrid looked up from her kettle with eyes that held intelligence and amusement in equal measure. You're the new fisherman, she said, not quite a question. How do you find Olaf's teaching methods? Thorough, Einar replied, holding up his battered hands as evidence. He believes in learning through experience. All the best teachers do. She ladled ale into a cup and offered it to him. Try this. It's a new recipe. I've been experimenting with juniper berries. The ale was exceptional, complex and satisfying in ways that spoke of genuine craft. Einar found himself nodding appreciation before he could calculate whether such enthusiasm was appropriate for a simple fisherman. It's excellent, he said honestly. Better than anything I've tasted in. He caught himself before mentioning the fine ales served at his estate. In a long time. Astrid's eyes sharpened with interest. You have experience with good ale, then? That's unusual for a fisherman. Most of them can't tell grain from grog after a long day on the water. Einar felt heat rise in his cheeks, aware that he'd nearly betrayed himself in the first real conversation of his disguise. I've travelled some, he said carefully. Tasted different brews in different places. Have you indeed? She leaned against her kettle with the casual grace of someone completely comfortable in her own space. And what brings a well-travelled man to our little village? Surely someone with your experience could find work in larger ports. The question held weight beyond mere curiosity, and Einar realized he was being evaluated with the same thoroughness Olaf had applied to his hands. But where the old fisherman had assessed his capacity for physical labor, Astrid seemed to be measuring something deeper, his honesty perhaps, or his reasons for being where he was. Sometimes a man needs to start fresh, he said, surprised by how true the words felt. Find out who he is when everything familiar is stripped away. Something shifted in Astrid's expression, a softening that suggested his answer had touched something real. That's either very wise or very foolish, she said. I haven't decided which. Maybe both, Einar replied, and was rewarded with a laugh that lit up her entire face. I like honest uncertainty better than false confidence, she said, refilling his cup without being asked. Most men who come through here either know everything or pretend they do. Neither type learns much. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young fisherman named Eric, whose swagger announced his opinion of himself before he opened his mouth. He elbowed past Einar with deliberate rudeness and slapped coins on Astrid's table with unnecessary force. Ale for a real fisherman, Eric announced. None of that fancy stuff with herbs, just honest drink for honest work. Astrid's smile could have frozen the fjord. Of course, Eric, the simplest brew for the simplest mind. Eric's chest puffed with pride, apparently missing the insult entirely. That's right. I don't need fancy additions to prove my worth. Unlike some people. His glance at Einar was pointed and hostile. Indeed, Astrid replied smoothly. Some people let their work speak for them, while others prefer to announce their importance to anyone who'll listen. This time Eric caught the barb, his face reddening as other customers chuckled. He grabbed his ale and stalked away with wounded dignity, leaving Einar impressed by Astrid's verbal dexterity. You handle admirers with remarkable skill, he observed. Practice, she said with a shrug. Half the young men in Svanhalla think they can win me with boasting about their fishing prowess or their father's wealth. They mistake loudness for strength and arrogance for confidence. What do you prefer in a man? Einar asked, then immediately wondered if the question was too direct. Astrid studied him with those sharp eyes, and he felt as if she were reading his thoughts. Someone who asks good questions instead of giving easy answers, she said finally. Someone who works quietly and lets his actions speak. Someone who knows the difference between confidence and pride. She handed him his refilled cup with a smile that held genuine warmth. Enjoy Olaf's training, Fisherman. I suspect you'll learn more than just how to mend nets. As Einar walked away from the brewing kettle, he carried with him more than excellent ale. He carried the memory of eyes that had looked at him with interest rather than calculation, words that had challenged rather than flattered, and the growing certainty that his impossible quest might not be impossible after all. The weeks that followed settled Einar into rhythms he'd never imagined could feel so natural. His hands, once soft as parchment, grew calloused and sure from handling nets and lines. His back strengthened from the daily labor of hauling catches from the fjord's cold depths. More importantly, his mind learned to find satisfaction in simple, honest work, the kind of satisfaction that came from earning each coin through sweat rather than inheritance. During his evening hours, he'd taken to carving fishing hooks from pieces of driftwood and bone, a skill he'd learned watching craftsmen at his estate, but never practiced himself. The work required patience and precision, qualities that his warrior training had developed, but his wealth had never demanded. Each hook he carved by lamplight became a small meditation, a connection to his new identity that felt increasingly real. Tonight, he sat outside the Salmon's Rest, working on a particularly fine hook carved from a piece of whalebone Olaf had given him. The bone was dense and smooth, taking the carving well, and he found himself lost in the careful work of shaping its curve just so. This hook would be his masterpiece, perfectly balanced, sharp enough to hold the strongest fish, beautiful enough to be proud of. "You have skilled hands for someone so new to the trade," came Astrid's voice from behind him. Einar looked up to find her approaching with a wooden bucket, apparently returning from the well. In the lamplight spilling from the inn's windows, her face held a warmth that made his chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't felt since youth, the helpless joy of being noticed by someone who mattered. "Practice," he said, echoing her earlier response about handling suitors. And Patience learned the hard way. She set down her bucket and moved closer to examine his work. "May I?" He handed her the unfinished hook, watching as she turned it in her fingers with the careful attention of someone who understood craftsmanship. Her touch was gentle but sure, and he found himself studying her hands, strong from brewing work, marked with small scars that spoke of honest labor, but graceful in a way that suggested an artist's sensibility. "This is beautiful work," she said, genuine admiration in her voice. "The curve is perfect and the point will hold true. Where did you learn such skill?" "My father," Einar replied, the lie coming easier now that it served a deeper truth. In a sense, everything he knew came from his father, the patience, the attention to detail, the understanding that quality work reflected the character of the worker. He believed a man should be able to make what he needed with his own hands. "Wise man," Astrid said, handing back the hook. "Too many men expect the world to provide for them without offering anything in return." She settled on the bench beside him with easy familiarity, as if they'd known each other for years rather than weeks. The movement brought her close enough that he could smell the sweet scent of brewing herbs that always seemed to cling to her hair and clothes. "Speaking of providing," she continued, Olaf says you've become his most reliable crew member. High praise from a man who thinks most fishermen are lazy by nature. The work suits me, Einar said, returning to his carving with steady strokes. There's honor in feeding people, in knowing your efforts put food on tables and silver in honest purses. Is that what you were seeking when you came here? Honor? The question caught him off guard with its directness. Astrid had a way of asking exactly what she wanted to know, without the careful politeness that usually hedged such inquiries. It was refreshing and terrifying in equal measure. Purpose, maybe, he said, after considering his words. I'd lost sight of why my work mattered. Here, when I bring in a good catch, I can see the difference it makes. Children eat better. Families have what they need. The connection between effort and result is clear. You speak like a man who's known work without purpose, she observed. What did you do before fishing? Einar's hands stilled on the carving. This was dangerous territory, but Astrid's eyes held genuine curiosity rather than suspicious interrogation. He decided to risk a version of the truth. I worked for a wealthy man, he said carefully. Managed his affairs, handled his business. The work was well paid, but empty somehow. I felt like I was moving pieces around a board without understanding the game. So you walked away from wealth to find meaning. There was no judgment in her voice, only interest, something like that. He resumed carving, using the work to steady his thoughts. A man's worth isn't in what he owns, but in what he contributes. I wanted to contribute something real. Astrid was quiet for a long moment, and when he glanced at her, she was studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Finally, she spoke. A man's worth is in what he contributes, she repeated slowly. I've never heard a fisherman speak quite like that. Einar's blood chilled. Had he revealed too much? Spoken too formally? He forced himself to continue carving, while his mind raced for an explanation that wouldn't shatter his carefully constructed identity. You think I'm putting on airs? He asked, attempting lightness. No, she said, surprising him. I think you're the first man I've met who understands that wealth without purpose is just decorated emptiness. Most people spend their lives chasing gold without asking why they want it. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by a deeper warmth. She understood not the deception but the truth beneath it. The loneliness that came from being valued for what you owned rather than who you were. What about you? He asked, turning the conversation away from dangerous ground. What do you contribute besides excellent ale? Her laugh was rich with genuine amusement. Questions that make people uncomfortable. Observations that disturb the peace. The occasional burnt loaf when I'm distracted by arguing with my sisters. All valuable services, Einar said gravely, and was rewarded with another laugh. You're an unusual fisherman, she said, rising and retrieving her bucket. Most of them talk about weather and fish prices. You talk about purpose and meaning. Maybe I'm an unusual fish, he replied. Pleased with his own wordplay. Maybe you are. She paused at the inn's door, looking back at him with that measuring gaze he was beginning to recognize. My father is hosting a small feast tomorrow night. Nothing grand, just family and friends sharing ale and stories. You should come. The invitation surprised him. I wouldn't want to intrude. You wouldn't be intruding. You'd be contributing. Her smile held warmth and something else, anticipation perhaps. Besides, I'm curious to hear what stories an unusual fish might tell. After she disappeared into the inn, Einar sat alone with his carving and the echo of her invitation. Tomorrow night he would sit at a family table, share stories and laughter, and continue weaving the web of deception that was beginning to feel more real than his actual life. He held up the finished fishing hook, admiring its perfect curve in the lamplight. It was honest work, honestly done, perhaps the most honest thing he'd accomplished in years. As he prepared for bed, he allowed himself to hope that tomorrow's feast might bring him closer to the honest love he sought, even as it required him to live the most elaborate lie of his life. The feast at Magnus Dagson's home proved to be exactly what Astrid had promised, intimate, warm, and filled with the kind of easy fellowship that Einar's grand banquets had never achieved despite their elaborate presentations. The brewmaster's hall was modest compared to Einar's estate, but it radiated genuine hospitality from its honey-colored wooden walls to the cheerful fire crackling in its central hearth. Magnus himself proved to be a bear of a man, with laugh lines carved deep around his eyes, and hands that spoke of decades spent working with grain and fire. His wife, Ingrid, possessed the quiet dignity of someone who managed a large household with efficient grace, while Astrid's two sisters, Sigrid and Thora, brought their own distinct energies to the gathering. Sigrid, the eldest, had inherited her mother's thoughtful nature, while Thora, barely past 16, bubbled with the irrepressible joy of someone who found wonder in everything. Einar found himself seated at their family table, sharing Magnus's prized ale horn, a masterwork of carved antler bound with silver that had belonged to the brewmaster's grandfather. The horn held a full measure of the family's finest ale, and when Magnus offered it to him with ceremony befitting an honored guest, Einar felt the weight of genuine inclusion. "So," Magnus said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a patriarch comfortable in his domain, "Astrid tells me you've proven yourself with Olaf's crew. High praise, considering that old Seawolf thinks most men are barely worthy of bailing water. The work suits me," Einar replied, accepting the ale horn with appropriate reverence. "Honest labor, honest rewards. Spoken like a man who's known the other kind," Ingrid observed, her sharp eyes studying him with maternal assessment. "You carry yourself like someone accustomed to finer things, yet you work nets without complaint. That's an interesting combination." Einar felt familiar tension creep up his spine. These people were perceptive in ways that court politicians, for all their scheming, rarely achieved. Their questions came from genuine interest rather than calculation, but that made them more dangerous to his deception, not less. "I've had occasion to observe wealthy men," he said carefully. "The lessons weren't always encouraging. Wealthy men often forget that silver can't buy character," Magnus agreed, raising the horn in an informal toast. "To honest work and honest company." The sentiment was echoed around the table, and as the evening progressed, Einar found himself relaxing into the warmth of genuine fellowship. These people accepted him based on his present actions rather than his past accomplishments, judged him by his character rather than his possessions. It was intoxicating in ways that even the finest wine had never been. Thora proved to be an enthusiastic questioner, peppering him with inquiries about his travels and experiences with the infectious curiosity of youth. Her questions were easier to navigate than her parents' subtle probing. She wanted stories and adventure, not deep analysis of his motivations. "Have you ever seen the great trading ports?" she asked, eyes bright with vicarious wanderlust. "Ships from distant lands bringing exotic goods and strange tales." "A few," Einar replied, thinking of the diplomatic missions that had taken him to such places. "The markets are impressive, but often the most interesting people are found in smaller places like this one." "Why?" Sigrid asked, joining the conversation with her more measured curiosity. "Because in great ports, everyone is playing a role. Merchant, diplomat, traveler. Here, people can simply be themselves." Astrid, who had been listening quietly while serving the meal, looked up from ladling stew. "That's assuming they are being themselves," she said with pointed meaning. "Sometimes people come to small places specifically to play different roles." The comment struck directly at Einar's deception, but her tone remained conversational rather than accusatory. Still, he felt heat rise in his cheeks and hoped the firelight would disguise his discomfort. "True enough," he admitted. "But eventually, honest work has a way of revealing honest character. A man can pretend many things, but daily labor tends to strip away pretense." "Like carving fishing hooks by lamplight?" Astrid asked, and he caught the subtle challenge in her voice. "Exactly like that," he replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "The wood doesn't care about your past. It only responds to skill and patience in the present moment." Magnus leaned forward with interest. "You carve fishing equipment? That's unusual for a fisherman. Most buy their gear from craftsmen. I find The work meditative, Einar explained, grateful for safer ground. And there's satisfaction in using tools you've made yourself. Show him the hook you finished last night, Astrid suggested, and Einar realized she'd been testing him, pushing to see if he would maintain consistency in his story under gentle pressure. He produced the carved bone hook from his pouch, and Magnus examined it with the appreciation of someone who understood fine craftsmanship. The brewmaster's eyebrows rose as he turned the piece in his weathered hands. "This is master's work," he pronounced. "The balance is perfect, the curve precise. Where did you learn such skill?" "My father taught me," Einar replied, the familiar lie coming easier with repetition. He believed a man should be able to create what he needed. "Wise philosophy," Ingrid agreed. "Too many young people expect others to provide everything for them." The conversation flowed on to other topics: fishing conditions, village gossip, plans for the upcoming harvest festival. But Einar remained aware of Astrid's occasional assessing glances. She was piecing together a puzzle, he realized, trying to reconcile his evident education and refined mannerisms with his claimed background as a simple fisherman. As the evening wound toward its close, Magnus pulled out his prized possession, a decent set of bone dice carved with intricate patterns and inlaid with silver. The family gathered around for their traditional end-of-feast game, something they called Odin's Wisdom, that involved both luck and strategy. "The rules are simple," Magnus explained as he handed Einar the dice. "Each throw tells a story about the thrower's future. 3 matching symbols mean good fortune, but the real game is in how you interpret the combinations." Einar rolled the dice with practiced ease, his years of gaming with fellow jarls serving him well. The bones tumbled across the wooden table and settled into a pattern that made the family exchange meaningful glances. "Fascinating," Magnus murmured, studying the configuration. 2 ravens and a ship. A journey motivated by wisdom, but with deception involved. The question is whether the deception serves good or ill purpose. Einar's blood chilled at the accuracy of the reading, but he forced himself to laugh casually. "Perhaps it means I'll learn to navigate by watching birds rather than following shorelines." "Perhaps," Astrid said quietly, but her eyes held thoughts she didn't voice. The evening concluded with warm farewells and invitations to return soon. As Einar walked back to the Salmon's Rest through Svanhalla's quiet streets, he carried with him the memory of genuine acceptance and the growing weight of his deception. These people were becoming more than marks in an elaborate scheme. They were becoming friends, family even. The ale-horn's warmth lingered in his memory, like a promise of belonging, but Astrid's perceptive questions echoed as warnings that his carefully constructed identity might not withstand much more scrutiny. Tomorrow would bring new challenges to his masquerade. But tonight he allowed himself to savor the taste of honest fellowship, even as he wondered how long such sweetness could last built on lies. The weeks following the feast marked the deepest period of Einar's transformation, when the line between his assumed identity and his authentic self began to blur in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. His relationship with Astrid had evolved into something precious and complex. Long conversations by the harbor at sunset, shared laughter over her sister's romantic entanglements, quiet moments that felt more intimate than any physical connection he'd ever known. On this particular evening, they sat on the pier, watching fishing boats return with the day's catch, and Astrid was telling him about her dreams for expanding the brewery. She spoke with animated passion about new techniques she'd learned from traveling merchants, herb combinations that could create unique flavors, ways to increase production without sacrificing quality. "Father thinks I'm too ambitious," she said, absently braiding and unbraiding a strand of her dark hair, a habit Einar had learned indicated deep thought. "He says the brewery has served our family well for 3 generations without major changes. Why risk disrupting something that works?" "Because standing still is often the same as moving backward," Einar replied, then caught himself. The observation came from years of managing estates and trade agreements, knowledge no simple fisherman should possess. I mean, he added quickly, even fishing changes. New techniques, better nets, different waters to try, but Astrid's sharp eyes had already caught his slip. You have interesting insights for someone who claims no experience with business, she observed. Sometimes you speak like a man who's managed important affairs. Einar felt the familiar chill of near discovery, but this time he decided to risk a partial truth. I told you I worked for a wealthy man before coming here. I observed how he made decisions, learned from watching his successes and failures. What kind of decisions? Her curiosity seemed genuine rather than suspicious, but he knew he was walking a knife's edge. Trade agreements mostly, resource allocation, how to expand operations without overextending. He picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the calm water, buying time to choose his words carefully. Wealth teaches certain lessons, even to those who only observe it from a distance. Astrid was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice held unusual gentleness. You saw enough to understand that wealth without purpose becomes its own prison. The statement struck him with unexpected force, because it captured exactly what he'd felt in his former life. Yes, he said simply, and the single word carried more truth than all his careful fabrications combined. She reached over and touched his hand where it rested on the pier's weathered planking. The gesture was brief but electric, sending warmth up his arm and straight to his heart. When he looked at her, he saw something in her eyes that made his breath catch. Not just affection, but understanding. She saw past his deception to something real beneath, even if she didn't know the full truth. I'm glad you found your way here, she said softly. To honest work, honest friends, to us. The word us hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Einar felt the full weight of his impossible situation. He was falling in love with a woman who cared for a man who didn't exist, while the man he actually was remained hidden behind layers of necessary lies. Their intimate moment was interrupted by the approach of hurried footsteps on the pier. They turned to see young Bjorn, not his retainer, but a village boy who shared the name, running toward them with obvious urgency. "Astrid!" the boy called. "Your father needs you at the brewery. There's a stranger asking questions about you and the new fisherman." Einar's stomach dropped like a stone thrown from a cliff. "What kind of stranger?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Big man, well-dressed, with the bearing of a warrior," the boy reported breathlessly. "Says he's looking for someone who might have come to our village recently. Described someone who looks very much like you." Astrid's eyes sharpened with alarm and something else. Protective instinct. "Go to my father," she told the boy. "Tell him we'll be there shortly." After the child ran off, she turned to Einar with determination. "Whatever trouble you're running from, we'll face it together." The assumption that he was fleeing rather than seeking stung, but Einar couldn't blame her for the logical conclusion. "Astrid, there are things about me that you haven't told me yet," she finished firmly. "I know. I've known from the beginning that you weren't what you seemed. Your hands were too soft, your speech too refined, your knowledge too broad. But I also know the man you've become here is real, whatever you might have been before." Her words should have brought relief, but instead they intensified his guilt. She was defending a deception, protecting a lie because she believed it served some greater truth. How could he tell her that the man she loved was both more and less than she imagined? They hurried toward the brewery, and Einar's worst fears were confirmed when he saw the familiar figure of Bjorn Ironwill speaking earnestly with Magnus near the brewery's entrance. His retainer had found him, which meant his carefully constructed new life was about to collide catastrophically with his abandoned old one. Bjorn spotted him immediately, and relief flooded the older man's weathered features. "My lord," he began, then caught himself as he noticed Astrid's presence. "That is, I've been searching for you with urgent news." Magnus looked between them with growing comprehension. "You know each other?" "We've met," Einar said carefully, praying that Bjorn would understand the delicate situation without explicit instruction. "What brings you so far south, friend?" Bjorn's eyes flickered with understanding. His master was maintaining a disguise and needed his cooperation. "Business matters that require your attention," he said diplomatically. "Affairs that cannot wait much longer." Astrid's hand found Einar's arm, her grip tight with sudden understanding. "You're leaving," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Not necessarily," Einar replied, though he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Bjorn's presence meant something serious had occurred at his estate, serious enough to risk exposing his location despite explicit instructions to maintain his absence. "We should speak privately," Bjorn suggested, his diplomatic training serving them both. "No," Astrid said firmly. "Whatever this is about, I want to hear it. I've invested too much in caring about this man to be shut out when his past catches up with him." Magnus nodded agreement. "My daughter speaks wisdom. Secrets have a way of poisoning relationships. Better to face truth together than hide from it separately." Einar looked at the three faces surrounding him, Bjorn's concerned loyalty, Magnus's honest directness, and Astrid's fierce determination to stand beside him, regardless of consequences. He had reached the moment he'd always known would come, when the elaborate fiction of his new life would have to confront the complicated reality of his old one. In his pocket, he carried the wooden comb he'd carved for Astrid, but hadn't yet found courage to give her, a simple thing that represented all the beauty he'd discovered in honest affection. Now it felt like a symbol of everything he was about to lose. "Very well," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his heart. "But perhaps we should go inside. This conversation may take some time, and privacy would be wise." As they moved toward the brewery's warm interior, Einar wondered if this would be the last time Astrid looked at him with trust instead of betrayal. The last time her hand sought his for comfort, rather than pushing him away. The reckoning he dreaded had finally arrived, and with it, the test of whether love built on partial truths could survive the weight of complete honesty. The brewery's interior felt suddenly cramped despite its generous proportions. The familiar sense of fermenting grain now sharp with tension. Magnus closed the heavy wooden door behind them and gestured toward the large table where the family usually shared their evening meals. The warm space that had welcomed Einar so often now felt like a tribunal chamber. Bjorn stood with the careful posture of a man navigating dangerous diplomatic waters, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. He'd served Einar's family long enough to read situations with the skill of a veteran counselor, and his eyes flickered between his master and the brewmaster's family with obvious concern. "Perhaps," Magnus suggested quietly, "we should begin with introductions. I suspect there's more to both of you than has been shared." Einar felt the weight of Astrid's gaze like a physical pressure. She stood close enough that he could smell the brewing herbs in her hair, but the familiar comfort of her presence now carried an edge of wariness. Her dark eyes held a mixture of confusion and hurt that cut him deeper than any blade. "My name is Bjorn Ironwill," his retainer began formally. "I serve as counselor and steward to Einar Goldtooth, Lord of the Northern Fjords." The words fell into the small space like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that reached every corner. Magnus's eyebrows rose toward his hairline, while Astrid's face went pale as morning mist. "Einar Goldtooth," she repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of each syllable. "The warrior lord whose wealth is sung about in taverns from here to the Icelands." "The same," Bjorn confirmed, his voice gentle but unyielding in its honesty. Astrid turned to stare at the man she'd known as a simple fisherman, and Einar watched comprehension dawn in her eyes like sunrise, revealing a landscape she'd never seen before. "You're not? You were never?" She couldn't finish the sentence, her voice catching on the enormity of the deception. "I was a fisherman," Einar said quietly. "For these past months, that's exactly what I was. Nothing I did or said in that role was false. Nothing except your entire identity," Magnus observed, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with evaluation. You deceived my family, shared our table under false pretenses, courted my daughter while hiding your true nature. The accusations hung in the air like smoke, impossible to dispel. Einar felt the careful construction of his new life crumbling around him, but worse than his own loss was the pain he could see building in Astrid's expression. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying the weight of all her confusion and hurt. "Why pretend to be poor when you command wealth that could buy entire villages? Why work nets and carve fishing hooks when you own estates and treasure hoards?" Einar reached instinctively toward his belt pouch, where his fingers found the smooth surface of his signet ring, the one piece of his true identity he'd carried throughout his masquerade but never dared to wear. The ring bore his family's crest and would serve as undeniable proof of his claims. But producing it would also finalize the destruction of everything he'd built here. "Because," he said, drawing out the ring and setting it on the table where its gold caught the lamplight, "every woman who ever showed interest in Einar Goldtooth wanted his treasure, not his heart. I needed to know if genuine affection could exist, if someone might love the man rather than his wealth." Astrid stared at the ring as if it were a coiled serpent. The signet was unmistakably authentic, its engravings too fine and detailed to be forged, its gold too pure to be anything but a lord's true seal. When she looked up, her eyes held a mixture of wonder and betrayal that made Einar's chest ache. "So you made yourself poor to test whether I was worthy of your trust," she said, her voice growing harder with each word. "You played the part of a humble fisherman while secretly judging whether I was mercenary enough to disappoint you." "No," Einar protested. But even as he spoke, he could hear how his explanation might sound like exactly that kind of cold calculation. "I wasn't testing you. I was trying to discover if love without calculation was possible. By lying to me every day for months," Astrid shot back. "By letting me defend your mysterious past to my family. By allowing me to fall in love with someone who doesn't exist." "He does exist," Magnus interjected unexpectedly, his deep voice cutting through their rising conflict. Both Einar and Astrid turned to stare at the brewmaster, who was studying the signet ring with thoughtful eyes. "The man who worked Olaf's nets exists. The one who carved fishing hooks by lamplight and spoke of finding purpose in honest labor. He's real enough. The question is whether he can exist alongside the Lord who owns half the northern territories." Bjorn cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I may, my lord, there are urgent matters that require your attention. Raiders have been spotted approaching our coastal settlements. Your military commanders need orders, and your allies are asking about your intentions." The mention of external threats sobered everyone in the room. Whatever personal drama was unfolding between Einar and Astrid, it existed within a larger world where real dangers threatened real people. "How serious is the threat?" Einar asked, immediately shifting into the strategic mindset that had made him a successful military leader. "Serious enough that I risked exposing your location to find you," Bjorn replied. 3 ships spotted off the northern coast, flying no banners we recognize. They've made no approach to negotiate, which suggests hostile intent. Astrid listened to this exchange with growing awareness that the man she'd fallen in love with was not just wealthy, but genuinely powerful, someone whose decisions affected the lives of thousands. The fisherman who'd carved her gifts and shared quiet conversations on the pier commanded armies and controlled territories. "You have to go," she said quietly, and the resignation in her voice cut Einar deeper than her earlier anger. "People depend on you. Your real responsibilities are calling." "Astrid, no!" she interrupted, stepping back from him as if distance could protect her from further hurt. "I need time to think, to understand what was real and what was performance. You've been living 2 lives, and I don't know which one includes room for me." Magnus moved to his daughter's side, offering the quiet support of someone who understood that some wounds needed space to heal. "Perhaps it would be best if you attended to your urgent business," he suggested to Einar. "Give emotions time to settle before attempting to untangle this knot." Einar wanted to protest, to demand the chance to explain himself more fully, but he could see the wisdom in Magnus's counsel. Astrid's pain was too fresh, his deception too overwhelming for rational discussion. Pressing now would only drive her further away. "I'll return," he said, looking directly at Astrid despite her obvious wish to avoid his gaze. "When the immediate crisis is resolved, I'll come back to answer any questions you have, to explain whatever you want to understand." "As Einar Goldtooth?" she asked bitterly. "Or as the fisherman I thought I knew?" "As the man who loves you," he replied simply. "Whatever name he carries." She flinched as if struck, and Einar realized that his declaration of love, delivered in the midst of her discovery of his deception, felt more like another manipulation than a genuine revelation. Bjorn moved toward the door with diplomatic efficiency. "My lord, we should depart. The tide serves, and speed may prevent tragedy." As they prepared to leave, Einar pulled the wooden comb from his pocket, the simple gift he'd carved for Astrid during countless evening hours. He set it on the table beside his signet ring, two symbols of his dual nature lying side by side. "I made this for you," he said quietly. "It's not much compared to what wealth could buy, but it represents hours of thinking about you, about what would bring you joy. Keep it or burn it as you choose, but know that every cut of the knife was made with love." Astrid stared at the simple wooden comb as if it held answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Go," she whispered. "Go save your people. But don't come back expecting forgiveness just because you can buy it." As Einar followed Bjorn out into the night, he carried with him the image of Astrid's tear-bright eyes and the weight of knowing that his quest for genuine love had succeeded only to destroy itself. He had found a woman who could love a poor fisherman, but whether she could love a wealthy lord remained an agonizing question without an answer. The ride north through the mountain passes felt like traveling backward through time, each mile carrying Einar further from the man he'd become and closer to the lord he'd never wanted to be again. His simple fisherman's clothes had been replaced by the familiar weight of mail and leather, and at his side hung the battle-worn shield that had protected him through a dozen campaigns. The artifact felt heavier than he remembered, not from its physical weight, but from the responsibilities it represented. Bjorn rode beside him in companionable silence, understanding that his master needed time to process the catastrophic collision of his two worlds. The older man had served long enough to recognize when counsel was wanted and when solitude was necessary. Behind them rode a small escort of household guards who'd been waiting at a prearranged meeting point. Their presence a stark reminder of the life Einar had temporarily abandoned. As they crested the final ridge before descending toward his estate, Einar could see the familiar dragon-head peaks of his great hall rising against the grey sky. Smoke from the watchfires dotted the surrounding hillsides, and he could make out the organized movement of troops preparing for potential conflict. His people had not been idle during his absence. "The threat assessment?" he asked, finally breaking the silence that had stretched between them for hours. "3 longships, possibly more beyond the horizon," Bjorn reported with military precision. "They've made no attempt at communication, but their scouting patterns suggest they're evaluating our coastal defenses. Your war chiefs believe they're probing for weakness before committing to a larger assault." Einar's strategic mind automatically began analyzing the situation. 3 ships could carry perhaps 150 warriors, enough to raid isolated settlements, but insufficient for a direct assault on his fortified holdings, which meant they were either the advance force for a larger fleet, or they sought a specific target that required stealth rather than overwhelming force. "Any demands? Ransom requests? Diplomatic overtures?" he asked. "Nothing. They appeared 4 days ago and have maintained distance while clearly observing our responses. It's almost as if they're waiting for something or someone." The implications of that observation settled uneasily in Einar's mind. Raiders who waited weren't typical raiders at all. They were either extraordinarily disciplined, which suggested professional military leadership, or they had specific intelligence about something worth waiting for. His estate came into full view as they descended the final slope. And despite everything that had happened in Svanhalla, Einar felt a familiar surge of pride at seeing his lands properly defended. Guard positions were occupied, livestock had been moved to secure pastures, and the civilian population showed signs of organized preparation rather than panic. His war chiefs had followed established protocols during his absence. Ragnar Bloodaxe, his most experienced military commander, met them at the gate with a relief so profound it was visible in his weathered features. The grizzled veteran had served Einar's father and possessed the kind of tactical wisdom that could only be earned through decades of successful campaigns. "My lord," Ragnar said formally, then allowed himself a slight smile. "Your timing is impeccable. We've identified the raiders' likely target." They gathered in the war room, a circular chamber beneath the great hall where maps and weapons created an atmosphere of serious purpose. Einar found himself automatically assuming the bearing of command, though part of his mind remained in a small brewery where a dark-haired woman was learning to hate him. "Report," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had never truly left him despite his months of self-imposed exile. Ragnar spread a detailed coastal map across the oak table. "The raiders aren't random opportunists. Their positioning suggests they know about the silver transport scheduled to pass through Svanhalla tomorrow." Einar's blood chilled at the mention of the village that had become so precious to him. "Svanhalla? What silver transport?" "The autumn tax collection from the southern settlements," Bjorn explained. "It follows the coastal route before turning inland toward our treasury. The convoy carries enough silver to make it an attractive target, but more importantly, it passes directly through the village where you've been residing." The tactical picture suddenly became clear, and with it came a growing sense of dread. The raiders weren't waiting randomly. They were positioning for an ambush at the exact location where Astrid and her family lived their peaceful lives. His two worlds weren't just colliding, they were threatening to destroy each other. How could they know the transport schedule? Einar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Someone with access to our planning provided intelligence," Ragnar confirmed grimly. "The timing is too precise to be coincidental. They know when the silver moves and which route it takes." Einar studied the map with growing urgency. Svanhalla's position made it an ideal ambush site. Narrow approaches that could be easily blocked, limited escape routes, and a civilian population that could be used as leverage. If the raiders struck while the silver transport was in the village, innocent people would be caught in the middle of a military action. "How many men can we muster?" he asked. 200 mounted warriors within 6 hours, Ragnar replied. "Another 100 foot soldiers by dawn. But if we ride in force, we'll announce our approach long before we arrive. The raiders will see us coming and either withdraw or use the villages as shields." The strategic puzzle was complex, but not impossible. Einar's mind worked through possibilities with the practiced efficiency of years spent solving military problems. But this wasn't just another tactical challenge. Every decision he made would affect people he'd grown to care about, particularly one woman whose trust he'd already shattered. "Alternative approaches?" he prompted. Bjorn spread additional maps showing the fjord's geography. A small force could approach from the landward side, using the forest paths to avoid detection. "If we coordinate with the silver transport's guards, we might catch the raiders between two forces. Or," Ragnar added thoughtfully, "we could warn the transport to avoid Svanhalla entirely, reroute through the inland passages. That leaves the village defenseless if the raiders decide to take their frustration out on civilians," Einar pointed out. "And it doesn't solve the larger problem of identifying who provided intelligence about our movements." He studied the maps in silence, weighing options that all carried significant risks. As a military commander, the logical choice was to protect the silver and minimize his own losses. As the man who'd fallen in love with Astrid, the only acceptable choice was ensuring her safety above all other considerations. "There's another factor to consider," Bjorn said quietly. "Your presence in Svanhalla is known to at least some of the villagers now. If the raiders have intelligence about the silver transport, they might also know about your recent activities. The implication hung heavy in the air. If the raiders knew that Einar Goldtooth had been living in Svanhalla, the village became more than just a convenient ambush site. It became a target for capturing or killing one of the region's most powerful lords. "You think this is personal?" Einar said. Understanding his retainer's concerns, "I think we should consider all possibilities," Bjorn replied diplomatically. "Your extended absence created opportunities for enemies to plan. This attack might serve multiple purposes." Einar looked at his battle-worn shield propped against the wall, its surface scarred by countless encounters with hostile blades. Tomorrow he would carry it into battle again, but this time he wouldn't be fighting for conquest or political advantage. He'd be fighting to protect people who had no stake in the larger conflicts of lords and kingdoms, simple, honest folk who deserved to live their lives without becoming pawns in others' schemes. "We'll take a mixed approach," he decided finally. 50 mounted warriors by the forest route, arriving before dawn to secure positions around the village. I'll approach openly with a small escort, making myself visible to draw the raiders' attention. The silver transport will proceed on schedule, but with additional guards concealed among the wagons. Ragnar frowned at the plan's complexity. "That puts you at considerable personal risk, my lord. If they're specifically targeting you, then they'll focus on me instead of innocent villagers," Einar finished. "Sometimes the best way to protect what matters is to make yourself the more attractive target." Bjorn studied his master with knowing eyes. "This isn't just about military strategy." "No," Einar admitted. "It's about proving that the man Astrid fell in love with, the one who worked nets and carved fishing hooks, is real enough to risk everything protecting what he's learned to value." They spent the remainder of the day finalizing plans, coordinating with the silver transport's captain, and preparing equipment for the morning's deployment. But as evening approached and Einar stood alone in his chambers, surrounded by the wealth and comfort that had once defined his entire existence, his thoughts turned to a small brewery where a woman might be holding a simple wooden comb and wondering if anything she'd believed about love was true. Tomorrow would bring battle, but tonight brought something harder. The knowledge that winning against the raiders might still mean losing everything that mattered. He could save Svanhalla and its people, but whether Astrid would ever forgive his deception remained a question that no amount of military victory could answer. His battle-worn shield waited by the door, ready to protect him in the coming fight. But against the pain of love betrayed, no armor had ever been forged strong enough to offer defense. Tomorrow he would discover whether redemption could be earned through action, or whether some wounds were too deep for even the most heroic gestures to heal. Dawn broke over Svanhalla with deceptive tranquility, the fishing boats setting out for their daily work, as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis in the space of a single evening. From his concealed position in the forest above the village, Einar watched the familiar rhythms of life beginning below, while his warriors moved into predetermined positions with the silent efficiency of seasoned campaigners. Ragnar's men had arrived in darkness, spreading through the wooded hills that surrounded the village like a protective embrace. Each fighter knew his role: wait for the signal, protect civilians above all else, and ensure no raider escaped to report back to any larger force that might be waiting beyond the horizon. Through the morning mist rising from the fjord, Einar could make out 3 dark shapes anchored just beyond the harbour mouth, the raider vessels holding position like patient predators. They'd been there since before sunrise, close enough to strike quickly, but far enough to avoid immediate retaliation. Professional work from professional warriors, which meant this wouldn't be a simple matter of overwhelming superior numbers. His battle-worn shield hung from his arm with familiar weight, its scarred surface testimony to countless encounters where strategy and courage had to merge into effective action. But this morning felt different from every other fight he'd faced. This time, personal stakes and military objectives had become inseparably intertwined. A movement in the village below caught his attention. Astrid emerged from the brewery, carrying a wooden bucket toward the well, with the same confident stride that had first captured his notice months ago. Even from this distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she glanced toward the harbor with awareness that something dangerous lurked just beyond sight. The villagers knew. Somehow word had spread about the threat, and Svanhalla was preparing itself with the quiet efficiency of people who'd survived by understanding when to fight and when to hide. Children were conspicuously absent from the streets. Livestock had been moved to secure areas, and the men moved with the deliberate purpose of those checking weapons and defensive positions. "Signal from the southern approach," whispered Torvald, Einar's scout captain. "The silver transport is 2 hours away, proceeding on schedule." Einar nodded acknowledgement while keeping his eyes on the village below. Soon, the carefully orchestrated elements of his plan would begin moving, and there would be no opportunity to adjust for unexpected developments. Success would depend on timing, communication, and the hope that his assessment of the raiders' intentions proved accurate. Another flash of movement drew his attention to the harbor, where Olaf Ironhand was securing his boat with more haste than usual. The old fisherman's weathered face showed grim determination as he moved toward the village center, clearly intent on organizing whatever defense the locals could muster. "The villagers are arming themselves," Torvald observed quietly. "That could complicate things if they get caught in crossfire. Or it could save their lives," Einar replied, remembering Magnus's steady courage and Astrid's fierce independence. "These aren't helpless farmers. They know how to fight when fighting's needed." As if summoned by his thoughts, Astrid reappeared, carrying what looked like a long fishing knife, not the tool of someone planning to hide until danger passed, but the weapon of someone prepared to defend her home. The sight sent both pride and terror through Einar's chest in equal measure. "My lord," came Bjorn's voice from behind him. The retainer approached through the forest, with the silent movement of someone who'd spent decades moving unseen when necessary. "Your escort is ready. The raiders have sent a small boat toward shore. Advanced scouts. Most likely." Einar accepted his war helmet from Bjorn, feeling the familiar weight settle over his head like the assumption of an identity he'd tried to leave behind. But as he secured the leather chin strap, he realized something had changed. He wasn't becoming Einar Goldtooth, the conquering lord again. He was becoming Einar the Protector, a man whose wealth and power served purposes larger than his own ambition. "Remember," he told Bjorn as they prepared to descend toward the village, "the goal isn't victory, it's protection. We win by keeping innocent people alive, not by killing the most enemies." "Understood, my lord." Though the two objectives often align in practice, they made their way down the forest path with deliberate visibility, Einar's shield and banner announcing his presence to anyone watching from the fjord. This was the most dangerous part of his plan, making himself an irresistible target while trusting that his hidden warriors could respond quickly, enough to prevent disaster. The village center came alive with activity as news of his approach spread. Magnus appeared in the brewery doorway, his expression grim but determined. Other villagers emerged from their homes, some carrying weapons, others moving children toward the most defensible buildings. And then Astrid was there, standing in the street with her knife held competently and her dark eyes blazing with defiant courage. When she saw him approaching in full war gear, her expression shifted through surprise, understanding, and something that might have been grudging respect. "So," she called out as he drew near, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "the wealthy lord remembers his subjects after all." The words stung, but beneath their bitter surface, Einar heard something else, recognition that he'd returned to face danger alongside them, rather than commanding from safety. It wasn't forgiveness, but it might be the beginning of understanding. "I remember my friends," he replied simply, then turned to address the growing crowd of villagers. "Raiders approach from the fjord. They seek easy plunder. but they'll find Svanhalla defended by people worth more than any treasure they could steal. The raiders struck with the precision of wolves who'd hunted together for years, their boats cutting through the morning calm like dark arrows aimed at Svanhalla's heart. Einar counted 40 warriors in the first wave, enough to overwhelm a fishing village, but not enough to face prepared resistance from trained fighters. The village bell began its urgent tolling as Olaf Ironhand pulled the rope with steady determination, its bronze voice calling across the water and hills with ancient authority. The sound served multiple purposes, warning civilians to take cover, alerting Einar's hidden forces to prepare for action, and announcing to the raiders that their approach had been detected. Form defensive positions around the market square, Einar commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in battle. Magnus, get the non-combatants into the brewery. It's the strongest building and has multiple exits. But even as he organized the village's defense, part of his attention remained fixed on Astrid, who showed no inclination to join the civilians seeking shelter. Instead, she positioned herself near the brewery's entrance with her knife ready, clearly intending to guard the retreat route for others, while staying close enough to the fight to matter. The raiders beached their boats with practiced efficiency. Their leader, a scarred giant wielding a massive war axe, immediately scanning the village for threats. When his eyes found Einar standing openly in the market square, recognition flashed across his weathered features. "Einar Goldtooth," the raider chief called out, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "I am Thorulf the Red, and I've traveled far to meet the famous lord who commands the northern fjords." "Then you've found me," Einar replied, raising his shield as his warriors moved into flanking positions with disciplined silence. "Though I doubt you've come for diplomatic conversation." Thorulf's laugh was like breaking timber. "I've come for your silver, your life, and your reputation. In that order of preference, though I'm flexible about which comes first." The raider chief's confidence suggested he knew more about the situation than a simple ambush should warrant. Either he had detailed intelligence about Einar's forces, or he commanded resources beyond the 40 men visible on the beach. "Before we begin this dance," Einar said, buying time for his hidden archers to achieve optimal positions, "satisfy my curiosity. How did you know to find me here, in this particular village?" "Gold buys many things," Thorulf replied with obvious satisfaction, "including information about wealthy lords who play at being poor fishermen. My employer was quite specific about where to find you." The revelation confirmed Einar's suspicions about betrayal within his own organization. But it also revealed something else. This wasn't random raiding, but a targeted assassination attempt disguised as opportunistic violence. Someone wanted him dead badly enough to hire professional killers and provide detailed intelligence about his movements. "Your employer chose his tools poorly," Einar observed, shifting his weight to prepare for combat. 40 men against a defended position with limited escape routes. Either he underestimated my capabilities, or he doesn't value your lives highly. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Thorulf's features. A truly professional raider would have scouted more thoroughly, would have noticed signs that Svanhalla was better prepared for trouble than most fishing villages. The silver transport chose that moment to appear on the southern road, its guards visible as armed escorts surrounding the wagons. Thorulf's eyes widened as he realized the full scope of the trap he'd walked into, not just a defended village, but a coordinated military operation designed to catch raiders between multiple forces. "Kill them all," he roared, raising his axe as his warriors charged toward the village center. The battle erupted with sudden violence, but instead of chaos, Einar's planning showed immediate results. Arrows flew from concealed positions in the surrounding hills, taking down raiders before they could close with the village defenders. The remaining attackers found themselves facing not panicked civilians, but organized resistance from fighters who knew exactly what they were doing. Einar met Thorulf's charge with his shield raised, the impact of the massive axe against scarred wood sending shockwaves up his arm. But years of combat experience served him well. He absorbed the blow's force and responded with a sword thrust that forced the raider chief to give ground. Around them, the battle developed with swift brutality. Village defenders fought with the desperate courage of people protecting their homes, while Einar's hidden warriors emerged from concealment to strike the raiders' flanks. The professional killers found themselves trapped exactly as Einar had intended. But in the midst of tactical success, personal disaster struck. A group of raiders broke away from the main fight, moving toward the brewery where non-combatants had taken shelter. Astrid stepped forward to block their path, her knife raised with determined courage. "Astrid, no!" Einar shouted, but Thorolf's renewed attack demanded his immediate attention. She faced 3 armed warriors with nothing but a fishing knife and fierce determination, the kind of hopeless courage that could get her killed while he was too far away to help. In that moment, all his careful planning and tactical advantages meant nothing compared to the simple, terrible fact that the woman he loved was in mortal danger. The village bell continued its urgent tolling, its bronze voice now marking seconds that might determine whether love could survive not just deception and betrayal, but the brutal arithmetic of violence itself. 3 months after the battle that saved Svanhalla, the village prepared for a wedding unlike any in its history. The autumn air carried the scent of harvest, celebrations, and the sound of hammers, as final preparations transformed the humble community into something worthy of hosting a lord's marriage, though this particular lord had insisted on simplicity over grandeur. Einar stood before the mirror in Magnus's home, adjusting the simple wooden wedding rings that would soon replace the elaborate golden bands tradition demanded. Each ring had been carved from driftwood found on Svanhalla's beach, their surfaces smooth from patient work and inlaid with silver that came not from his treasure hoard, but from his first honest wages as a fisherman. "Nervous?" Bjorn asked, entering with the careful smile of someone who'd watched his master transform from lonely lord to fulfilled man over the course of a remarkable year. "Terrified," Einar admitted honestly. Leading armies into battle never felt as dangerous as promising to love one woman for the rest of my life. Through the window, he could see guests arriving for the ceremony, not the political alliance makers who would have attended a traditional noble wedding, but fishermen and craftsmen, brewers and farmers, people whose presence represented the community he'd chosen to join, rather than the status he'd been born to inherit. His transformation hadn't been simple or swift. The battle's end had brought military victory but emotional uncertainty, with Astrid's fury over his deception, warring against her reluctant admiration for his willingness to risk everything protecting her village. The weeks that followed had required patient rebuilding of trust, honest conversations about identity and authenticity, and his gradual integration of his 2 selves into something new, a lord who served his people rather than commanding them, a man whose wealth enhanced community rather than isolating him from it. "She's ready," came Magnus's voice from the doorway. The brewmaster had initially struggled with his daughter marrying nobility, but Einar's insistence on living simply, his genuine contribution to village life, and most importantly, his obvious devotion to Astrid had gradually won the older man's approval. Einar walked to the small ceremony site beside the harbour, where chairs had been arranged in simple rows facing the water. No grand cathedral or elaborate decorations, just the community that had become his home, gathered to witness the union of 2 people who'd found each other through deception, but chosen each other through truth. Astrid appeared at the top of the path, and Einar's breath caught as it had that first evening months ago. She wore a simple dress of blue wool that complemented her dark hair, and around her neck hung a silver pendant he'd commissioned from the village silversmith, not because she needed expensive gifts, but because he wanted to mark this day with something beautiful, made by local hands. But it was her expression that stopped his heart. The wariness and hurt that had shadowed her features after his revelation were gone. replaced by joy and confidence and something deeper, the settled certainty of someone who'd made peace with loving a complicated man in a complicated world. As she joined him before the assembled community, Olaf Ironhands stepped forward to officiate. The old fisherman had been chosen not for religious authority, but for the respect he commanded from everyone present, his weathered hands steady as he raised them for silence. Marriage, Olaf began in his gravelly voice, is like fishing in deep water. You can't always see what you're catching, but you learn to trust your line, your instincts, and your partner. These two have learned to trust each other through storms that would sink lesser vessels. The ceremony proceeded with rustic dignity, vows spoken in words that emphasized partnership over possession, mutual growth over traditional roles. When the time came to exchange rings, Einar took Astrid's hand and spoke the words he'd rehearsed countless times, but which still emerged with heartfelt sincerity. I give you this ring not as a symbol of my wealth, but as proof of work done with love, he said, sliding the simple wooden band onto her finger. It represents hours spent thinking of you, time invested in creating something worthy of your wearing. With it, I promise to choose you every day, to build our life together through honest effort rather than inherited privilege. Astrid's response made several guests wipe their eyes discreetly. I give you this ring as a symbol of growth, she said, her voice steady and clear. Like the tree it came from, our love has weathered storms and put down deep roots. With it, I promise to see you clearly, the lord and the fisherman, the wealthy man and the one who carves gifts by lamplight. All of you always. When Olaf pronounced them married and invited Einar to kiss his bride, the gathering erupted in celebration that seemed to echo across the fjord itself. But for Einar, the world narrowed to Astrid's face, her smile, the way she looked at him with complete acceptance of who he was, all of who he was. The feast that followed blended the best of both their worlds. Fine foods provided by Einar's resources were prepared by village cooks and served with ceremony that honored tradition without ostentation. Stories were shared, songs were sung, and as evening approached, toasts were raised with Magnus's finest ale, served in cups ranging from simple wood to precious metal. To the fisherman who caught more than he bargained for, called out Eric, the young man who'd once resented Einar's presence but had come to respect his genuine contributions to village life. To the lord who learned that real wealth can't be counted in silver, added Helga from the Salmons. Rest, but the toast that mattered most came from Astrid herself, who rose as the sun began setting over the fjord they both loved. To honest love, honest work, and the courage to become who we're meant to be rather than who we were born to be. As night settled over Svanhalla and the celebration continued around them, Einar and Astrid walked to the end of the pier where their love had first begun to grow. The simple wooden rings on their fingers caught starlight, and in that moment Einar understood that his quest was complete. He'd sought a woman who could love a poor man as deeply as a rich one, and he'd found something even more precious, a woman who could love all of him, wealth and simplicity together. Because she understood that true worth lay not in what a person owned, but in what they chose to become. The water lapped gently against the pier, and somewhere in the distance, a fishing boat returned home with its nets full of silver-bright fish, honest wealth earned through honest work, exactly as it should be.